There's also the idea that Nassim Nicholas Taleb says that except for a book, everything else is trying to manipulate you with an ad. That's the only place where you won't see like, hey, by the way, have you checked out these tires from this company? That's the only place where that hasn't happened yet. It's the last frontier against advertisement. As someone who makes my money from advertisements, I understand it, but but it's important to have some things to be completely devoid of agenda.
Hello and welcome to Lit Visions, a podcast about fiction, its future, and other possibilities in literature. My name's Dhruv and I'm your host. Today I have a wild and freewheeling conversation with Vinamre Kasanaa, who is an old friend and the host of Dostcast, India's fastest growing podcast that recently hit 300,000 subscribers. I've been a 2-time guest on his show where we spoke a lot about fiction, technology, Royal Enfield motorcycles, and meditation. And in this episode, we cover topics like the tension between literature and social media, poetry as a means of spiritual seeking, how paperback novels are the last frontier against advertising, why books should be treated as wellness tools, and lots more, including discussing the works of Jack Kerouac and John Williams. What I love about this conversation is that we get unapologetically lost in some far-flung ideas, yet find our way back to the present. Vinamre is a fascinating guy and a purist at heart. It's always a pleasure jamming with him. I should also mention that this episode was recorded in person at Vinamre's makeshift Airbnb studio on a rainy Mumbai night. And it happened pretty impromptu. We were meeting just to catch up and then somehow ended up hitting the record button. I'd like to thank him and his team for setting up the space so cozily and for the delicious masala chai we sipped throughout. Now, without further ado, here's Vinamre Kasanaa.
Vinamre,
What's up, brother?
I'm good, man. Let's just get into it with a big question. What does literature, poetry, fiction, what do these things mean to you?
I think it's a mixture of rest and exploration, because I started to get into all of these loosely defined intersection of these things when I was I think 6 or 7 years old. A basic love for drawing stuff, and that went to writing. And then my mom would buy me a lot of books, mythological books and simple books. Like there was a David and Suzanne book that I owned, which was basically, I don't know if you know about that. You know about it?
I do.
It's a very specific book that I don't think, I've talked to a bunch of people about it. They didn't have it, but David and Suzanne were the protagonists, and it would just be these two kids in several situations with their family, and it was just a picture book. So it's the most memorable book that comes to mind when you say all of those things together.
I think there's a UK parallel to David and Suzanne books. I don't know if it's officially a parallel, but they were called the Biff and Chip books. Biff was a girl, Chip was, I think, her brother, and they had a dog called Floppy.
Yeah.
And they were in all these like adorable situations together, and I was brought up on that diet. Yeah.
But it's just like, for example, there's a bathroom where the dad is shaving, the mother is in the bubble bath. How that happens is beyond me, of course. So I think that's the first memory of it. And then because of my parents' encouragement and I guess like a slightly natural acumen for writing or language, it just sort of started to snowball into school debates and writing competitions, but from a very academic standpoint with like genuine constraints. So like writing 200 words on freedom fighters.
Yep.
It's a very, like regimented way of looking at it. But then like genuine poetry, I think I was always writing poetry in school, but it was like, I think my English skills were slightly better than my classmates without being cocky about it. So, and I like to mystify by using big words. But then I really honed in on the skill to the point where I think some of the stuff that I write is good is when I went to college and I took this class called Poetry Now, which is a proper poetry class. And at the same time, I was listening to a lot of Jim Morrison's, he's got one spoken word poetry album called An American Prayer. So those things happen in tandem. And then I think finally, the ones that I post on Instagram, at least, I'm not talking about writing, just specifically poems, that I think happened as a consequence of one, running a writing course, second, making content, where I realized that the mystification and the navel-gazy nature of my observations was standing in the way of, maybe communicating it to more people. When I decided to see it as a self-expression but service, is when I started to write poems that rhyme really well, but then many people can understand them without becoming groupie core, of course.
Yeah. Talk more about content and art, something we talk about offline and think about offline as well. Do you feel that tension right now? So you're running this extremely fast-growing podcast.
Yeah.
And maybe you're now feeling the pressure to perhaps be like relevant, quote unquote, and be like popular, quote unquote, without losing the essence of who you are and being that like unhinged guy that writes poetry on Instagram and says whatever that comes to mind. Like, what do you think about content and art and the tension between the two, the relationship between the two as well?
I just want to say I love being on this podcast, and I'm going to share it on the Dostcast community post and everywhere else, because I want to speak the truth, the absolute truth. I think it's a bloody nightmare. It's a nightmare because I never thought that I would be lying if I didn't say that I didn't write for others. I always wrote, but my intention was always to sort of gloat about it and to have people see it. But I was very happy with...
I think everyone wants their work to be seen to some degree. I haven't figured out whether the majority of folks write for others, though. I was having this conversation on a previous podcast that will be published soon with someone, an author who said, for him, he writes for himself. And the way that he actually got into... He's a speculative fiction writer in California. And he wrote his first novel simply because there was a story that he wanted to read, like a very specific kind of a story. He went to the library, went online, couldn't find it, and felt, I'm going to write that story, which is quite unusual. I found that's quite an interesting, way of like almost seeking for a story and finding something that resonates. And then he talked about how, like, if you look at someone like Stephen King, apparently he writes for his wife, right? Apparently he sees like every single one of his novels as a long form letter to his wife. And for him, it's like, she's going to love this. She will enjoy reading this. And it turns out there's a lot of people like Stephen King's wife who also loved it and bought his books. Yeah. So I didn't mean to derail you.
No, of course.
That's interesting and very honest as well, that you are, let's say, consciously writing to be seen and being honest about that, because I think most people are.
Yeah, I think about that, the Stephen King note about writing for his wife, I read it somewhere. I read it on Brain Pickings, and it's now Marginal Alien. I don't know why they changed.
No, they shouldn't have done that.
Bad branding. Yeah, just bad branding. But she was mentioning an author on that who said that if you write for the whole world, or if you open your window and you sing to the world, you'll get pneumonia, something along the lines of you should always write for one person. Smarter people, more cutthroat people in the content world would say you should write for your target audience, 18 to 24. I say the nitpick. But I think I write for myself because I'm feeling something. I then just edit it for readability. That's it. I generally think that the seed is still for myself. Because I try not to, put in something popular if it stands in the way of truth. I just do the truth part because that doesn't sit right with me. also because, to answer your question about content and art, poetry is still sacred to me. And if I make it content, if I have a schedule, a calendar for it, or if I start reading poetry forms, rhyme, rhythm, meter, I know what these words mean. But if I start doing any deliberate attempts at becoming a better poet, it's just going to be like one of the last frontiers of sacredness are going to be lost, because content is not sacred.
Right.
Because you realize that you have productized long form conversations. You're not seeking God. There is nothing divine in them. There may be hints or intimations of genuine insight or moments of profundity, a lot of laughter, but it's not sacred, right? Because some of the times I treat conversations as very matter of fact. It's just something I must do. That's it. I try to be, I'm not over the moon about, oh my God, I get to podcast. There's these moments every now and then, but it isn't like something that really makes me feel like, wow, I am living my dream. It's just a medium, and I just happen to be the person who just has conversations with people. With poetry, I don't think about any public use of it, any way of making it into content, because I feel like that'll just rob me of soul completely. It'll just make me devoid of anything magical that still exists in my life.
Wow.
And I'm just being super honest.
I love it. I feel like I have a lot of thoughts and also none at all based on that. You said something interesting, just to bring this down a level now, back to content, target audiences, demographics. It feels like content, there's always some kind of like agenda, which I wouldn't say that, let's say, fine art or literary fiction is literary fiction. That's interesting. Literary fiction is also, I wouldn't say it's like free from agenda, right? There is always some underlying purpose, whether it's to shine a light on a particular character or a particular situation, or to simply tell a very, very important story that needs to be told. But I do feel like one of the big differences is that content is like extremely optimized, extremely statistical. It's almost like, I feel like it's machine gun fire on the senses
100%.
on like a daily basis. And literature or art or whatever you want to call it isn't that. It's like deliberately slower. You can live in it. You can gestate. You can take your time. And there's no explicit like call to action as such. It's just is, and that's what's beautiful about it.
Yeah, which is why, and I know a lot of content purists will laud its democracy and how it's changing the world in very tangible ways. While all of that is fine, I have also confessed this to you offline. My biggest revelations and the joys of my life have come from stories. I see content as distribution of ideas. As well, in my case, the podcast is a show that I run. It isn't always self-expression. There are moments where I indulge, and there are those. In the end, it's just pure service to whoever listens. It isn't me talking about my love for, say, how much I love my boots for 20 minutes. And content is optimized for a lot of people. It is optimized for obviously reaching more and more people, because one of the weird things about content is that no one questions the metrics. No one questions where it's going. No one questions how it snowballs. Everyone just assumes it must snowball.
Yep.
And everyone just suggests accordingly. The people who make content are in a weird spot, because one, a lot of them, well, it's a little different for people who have never had social approval or recognition of any kind. So for them, it becomes life or death. But if you've had those things, you really start to feel at what point is the optimization standing in the way of what you really want to say. But as far, if I have to give you like a solid answer, whenever that tension emerges, I just do something that is private and sacred and is not meant for broadcasting. Because once you start seeing a video or an essay being shared or getting views, the KPIs are pretty strong. You start to let that bleed into other parts of your life.
Yep.
So whenever I feel like I'm doing that too much, I always shift to my inner life. And it's very interesting because I consult with a psychoanalyst every 2 weeks, and I was just complaining to him like, I'm surrounded by people all the time. I feel like I just deal with people all the time. And I was just like scratching my hair. It's like, who am I? I'm just this person who is hospitable to people, just around people all the time, transacting with all kinds of people, just a relationship manager in essence. Because I was at breaking point. And so he said that you have to carve out time for your soul, which seems a little woo-woo, but he was making sense. Because what happens is when you professionally deal with people all the time in the guise of a casual podcast, you become very transactional. You do not know. Sometimes you don't know anything beyond the conversation that initiates the text message that initiates with the conversation with someone that, hey, I want to do a podcast, the actual podcast, and the goodbye, I had fun, and then the conversation that's the text that says, hey, the podcast is out, thank you so much, and that's it. And that happens week after week after week after week, and you ask yourself, how many of these people can actually be friends with? How many of these people do I have a deep connection with? Is my life supposed to be 90% just, soft touch points with all these people I just have conversations with? Am I fake deeping my way through life? Or is there any substance to these people that I'm meeting in terms of like the relationship I have with them? So, I sort of forgot what you asked, but
So have I, but it doesn't matter. I don't think we're going to stick to questions in this one.
Okay.
I forgot what I was about to say. I was about to say something in response to what you just said. I think that really resonates. I feel like that question of being with yourself or being around people, I personally feel that it takes almost an enormous amount of like psychological risk and spiritual risk to actually get to know yourself, right? And I feel that a lot of the time people surround themselves with other people, or they enter like one relationship after another because it's terrifying to be alone with yourself. It's terrifying to really get to know yourself and understand how much of you is like authentic. And I don't mean authentic to other people, but even to yourself. Like I feel so much of life is just undoing what you've picked up from your past.
Yeah.
Right? Parents, friends, early associations. And by the time, if you're lucky enough to even figure that piece out, your life is over. You're already old and perhaps even somewhat like fixed or rigid in your views. So I feel, and it's not easy. It's not easy to be by yourself and to understand yourself. And the reason I bring this up is I feel like it has, it's a more relevant topic than ever before, because it's harder than ever to be on your own now. Even when you're isolated in the room, you have this,
you always pick up your phone
thing attacking you every single moment, like just literally attacking you. And
I'm very okay with that militant language, by the way, because I use the same language for phones.
I'm not a fan of phones, man. I really like, obviously they've done, like any important technology, they've done so much good. They've enabled so much. Like we probably couldn't have this conversation without so much of this great technology.
I hate that we have to use disclaimers. for phones. You know?
That too. I just think it's unfair to like be too militant when it comes to a lot of these things, because hey, you know, and also like people love to assume that the people that built this stuff had like really, really bad nefarious intentions.
That was not the case.
It wasn't at all. It's just like we're just bad at complexity and understanding the consequences of our decisions, right?
Yeah.
But it is hard. It is hard, and I do think that like the metaphor of machine gun fire, like notifications, ding, 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 ding. It's really, really hard. It takes a massive amount of like self-discipline. Here's another thought. It'd be interesting to get your thoughts on this. Something I've been like mulling over. I feel like picking up a paperback novel today, I feel it's almost like a wellness tool, right? No longer just entertainment or indulgence. I feel it's almost like it can be turned into some kind of like training program to get your attention back, right? Just like sit with this 300-page novel without your phone and make it through. One, it will be really fun if the story resonates with you, and two, I do feel it's healing, right? Therapeutic, meditative, in the same 100%. Way that why meditation is effective. It's just like being with yourself for a defined or undefined moment of duration of time.
Yeah.
And that's great.
Whenever I actually read a paperback, I tell the people closest to me, I feel like myself again.
Wow.
I feel like, hey, remember who I used to be?
Right.
I feel like that again. Mostly because I'm in the business of making content. Mm-hmm. But I started off with, it sounds like I'm in the mafia. It was like, I started off with good intentions, now I can't escape this life. That's not the case at all.
YouTube mafia.
Yeah, YouTube mafia for sure. But I recently read, so it's very funny that you've sort of met me in my life where I feel the good and bad consequences of exposure and content creation, and I see it in opposition to who I was before. Because I read, it's not exactly fiction, but it's semi-fiction. It's Big Sur by Jack Kerouac.
Okay.
So at this point, Jack Kerouac has become famous. He was the king of the beats, but now he's a famous writer. So now he's dealing with fame, his long lost solitude. His friends have sort of grown up and married and whatnot. He's still got his motley crew of drunks. But he's fallen into alcoholism as he struggles to understand his new place in the world. As the king of the beats, as the best writer in America, all of those things. And so he drinks to forget. By the end of the book, he is so drunk, perpetually drunk for weeks on end, that he just starts to lose it. He generally gets crazy. And it's a semi-fictional account. But reading that just put me in touch with emotions that I'd sort of repressed. That, I mean, whenever they would well up to the surface, I could always use my phone and see how our YouTube channel was doing.
Yeah.
I could always call a friend. Hell, I could even use a 5-minute meditation to keep going, to keep the machine pumping.
Yep.
Whereas like the meditation is basically kerosene for the, or like if there was a fuel for machine guns, if it's a cannon, right? Like it's gunpowder.
We could record an entirely other podcast on that. I feel like the West, how I'm generalizing by saying
weaponized meditation.
Yeah, man. I think that like, when did it become a productivity hack?
Yeah.
When did it become like a way to boost your creativity? When did it become like a value proposition? Right?
Yeah.
By design, it was always like goalless. And yet now it's like sleep less, meditate more. Want more energy? Meditate.
Yes.
Want to become more creative? Meditate. Want to know yourself? Meditate. 20 minutes a day, 7 days a week, $9.99 a month. You know what I mean? Like it's, continue.
So no, but it's true though. Like sometimes when like, you know, Silent and Yathartha here, they're both here for my team. Sometimes when we have done too much busy work and we have a podcast right after and I need to reset, I do a Wim Hof meditation. Not to feel the joys of meditation, but simply to be ready for the next set of productizing a conversation. So this book, I'm nowhere as famous, but if I could just on the inner side, on in my private life, if I could just indulge in relating with this guy, I could. I sometimes still use alcohol or frivolous conversations, too many of those, or checking my phone constantly, or distracting myself with the company of friends instead of thinking and being alone, as a way to cope. Right? And so this book sort of reintroduced that to me, except one, it was written by one guy. It's one long story. It isn't low resolution, chaotic, incoherent information, which is what typically you see on a feed. So I was hooked.
Yep.
And initially it was hard because he has a very spontaneous prose-like style. But I knew I was on the right track when I spent an entire afternoon reading it in a cafe. Where I could have just been doing busy work on the laptop. I mean, there's invoices to be filed. There's analytics to be checked. There's things, filler work to be done. Really, there's no work that afternoon, but it's just that I have a laptop bag. I do this for a living. So I must use that laptop instead of sitting back and reading. And then I look around at cafes. It's just, unless you're up in the hills, in metropolises, I don't know about Mumbai, I see people barely reading.
Yep.
It's just busy work. And for me, books have become an antidote for busy work.
Yep.
They've also, it's this book, other books, they've also allowed for my mind to kind of get away from the instructive quality of most things online to a world where I can just be an observer.
Yeah.
So, I mean, those are just some of my thoughts on that.
Amazing. Firstly, I think I'm going to read that book. That sounds like beautiful.
Yeah, it's great.
What I love about experiences like that, and I would definitely describe them as spiritual experiences, because they remind us like how much we have inside of us, and we're just not like consciously aware of it, right? Like you could meet a person who perhaps doesn't self-identify as like a creative person or a sensitive person or an empathetic person, who doesn't seem on face value in touch with their emotions. And then you experience a piece of like literature that you feel like speaks to you, and there's a familiarity with the specific sentiments in that book, even though you've never consciously expressed them, let alone articulated them.
Yeah.
I don't know why I'm always just like mind blown at whenever that happens, because I feel like, wow, there was also this thread inside me that's just strummed.
It's very precise.
I had no
emotions.
idea that it was there. Yeah.
In this book here, there's this moment where Jack Kerouac realizes that he's not in love with this woman. It's just that he's been drinking too much. So she's just been a comforting presence in the background who also needs a man to take care of her and her son. And he's just the right kind of drunk, intelligent idiot who wakes out of his stupor every now and then to say something clever and like talk about love and have sex, and then like just, be drunk and lose again and then forget what happens for days. And it's a specific kind of thing when he's so drunk that he cannot be drunk anymore. He talks about like the 4 or 5 stages of being drunk, that instead of the alcohol seeping out of his body through sweat, on a full-blown like on a head full of alcohol, he realizes that he doesn't love her. She's just this person he's found on a bender, and it's been months. And I instantly thought it's a lot like, we use people as anchors sometimes.
Wow.
Because we're too afraid of confronting ourselves. And if we're going down the wrong path and they don't stop us, but they just sort of stand in the corner or they hover in the background and say nice things, you feel like they're great for you, but they're not. And so it's like, how specific can you get? Who else in your life would come and tell you this specific thing about the spectrum of emotions you can feel?
Yep.
Only a book can do that through multiple events and descriptions. No one can say that thing to you.
Yeah.
You know?
I think also there's actually a number of directions I want to go down, but I'll go down this one for now. I feel there is something to be said about the temporal aspect of books, like the fact that it takes a period of time.
Yeah.
Right. Maybe a few hours, maybe a few days, maybe a few weeks. If you're reading something really, really long, it could take you months and months, right? You could be reading the same novel for 6 months or a year. When I met my wife, we had this conversation, one of the first conversations that we had, and I was like, okay, wow, this is really, really insightful. We were talking, she's a big reader, and we were talking about like the power of books. And she said that for her, any art form is like an exercise in empathy, right? And I don't really believe in demonizing other forms of media as well. Everything is different and serves like a unique purpose, right? But let's say the difference between watching a film and a book, beyond the obvious, like they're very, very different forms of expression. A film can take an hour, 90 minutes, 2 hours. A book will take longer. So you are almost like committing to that empathy for longer, right? And that's really, really powerful, right? That's not to say that films aren't powerful. Films are massive tools for like empathy and social change and entertainment and fun and what have you. But there is something beautiful about like immersing yourself in a world for an unspecified amount of time and just living in it. And it's difficult to describe like what was the value, quote unquote, but you do feel like nourished. You feel like you've almost like, been swimming and you've left the water, and part of the pool, part of the water is still on you, right? And it will be with you. The salts from the water or whatever, they will stay with you, and you've somehow like come out changed. I wouldn't even say evolved, because that's not even necessary. I don't think the purpose of fiction is to necessarily help us evolve, but it is definitely there to help expose different ways of life and different ways of thinking and being.
Yeah. I'm reminded of Chuck Palahniuk. I keep mentioning him because the only sort of writing advice book that I've generally read and enjoyed is consider this moments from my writing life after everything was different. And he comes from the school called Dangerous Writing, and he's talking about how, well, first of all, there's also the idea that Nassim Taleb says that except for a book, everything else is trying to manipulate you with an ad. That's the only place where you won't see like, hey, by the way, have you checked out these tires from this company? That's the only place where that hasn't happened yet. It's the last frontier against advertisements. As someone who makes my money from advertisements, I understand it, but it's important to have some things to be completely devoid of agenda beyond, unless there's like a business leader who wants to like showcase their thought leadership, but those books are bad, obviously. But what I wanted to get at from that is Chuck Palahniuk said that think of the friction you must overcome to actually buy a book and read it, right? And he says usually people buy books at airports,
right?
Because they've got that unspecified amount of time where they can't do anything with their cell phones,
life,
right? With their life as well, right? Like, what are you gonna do? Eat? That's like, if it's a long flight, that's twice, 15 minutes each, right? And even after that, the air hostess will come and say, please, give me your like leftovers. You can't just like sit looking at it. He said, because there is so much friction, and the time you actually buy a book, even as a non-reader, is at airports. It's your duty as a writer to commit to creating something as close to rebellion or like sheer spectacle in the written word. Otherwise, it's a waste of time. If even there you choose like a safe path, and you don't dazzle your reader, you don't intimidate them, you don't force them to think, you don't, create a spectacle, you're doing it wrong. Because everything else is frictionless. The moment you open your phone, you see something, even if it's of value. Even if Warren Buffett writes a thread, there's 1,000 threads competing for your attention. You're not going to take it seriously. The physical investment of paying money, buying a physical book, opening it up, reading it, you already have spent too many steps, and gotten over friction to read it. And even then, if you don't have substance in it, you run the risk of making that person turn away from books forever. Which is why I think when people pick up, which is why I think that airports really shouldn't have those boring bestsellers. I think they should have banned books that polarize people, because it's supposed to be an experience.
Yeah. Again, so many different directions we could go down. If we tug on the thread of reading, because this was something I was chatting with previous guest, Elliot Pepper, the speculative fiction writer. And so much of what he said resonates so much, especially in the light of what you've just said, right? So he's written 10 novels.
Wow.
Received lots of praise from folks like Seth Godin, New York Times Book Review, Popular Science, and many other places. And he writes like speculative, thrilling, near future science fiction, right? Like asking just very interesting what if questions about the world of technology, the world of science, the world of culture. And he talked about how with his first book, because he has an entrepreneurial background as well, like he built a startup, he worked in a VC in the US, he like worked at companies. So he was quite familiar with the world of growth. And I think he tried a lot of that stuff as an author. And he said, it's not even about like purity or spirituality. It just doesn't work, man. Right? Like the traditional rules of like getting content out there or growing a product don't work. The only thing that's worked for him has been word of mouth. And by word of mouth, that isn't like going and shouting down a megaphone to lots of people on social media. He says that when he writes a book, he literally emails someone who he feels will enjoy it because of who they are, because of the newsletters that they've been reading together, because of their interactions in the past. And all he asks is that you accept this gift of this book and enjoy it. And if they enjoy it, typically we love to recommend books on your podcast before. I remember we have gone back and forth on a number of novels just because it's a joy. It's a joy to share like a book that has had, an impact on your life, on your thinking. So yeah, I find that really interesting. It is to some degree like the last frontier against optimization. And yet it's also not like free from the cackles of like optimization or the market. It just means you have to think about it very, very differently. Like playing safe doesn't really work because we don't pick up novels just for something incrementally like more addicting, right? We want to be almost like radically transported or radically moved or not moved at all and like paralyzed, right? Basically some kind of like sensation at the extreme. It can even be like mundane, even, like mundanity is also, I think, a form of an extreme state. There's a book that I absolutely love that not a lot of people know about. In fact, it's literally described, I think, on the cover by some reviewer, like this is the best novel that you've never heard of, called Stoner.
I was going to say that.
Have we talked about this before?
Yes.
Okay,
you recommended the book to me.
Oh, wow.
I read it when I was alone in Ladakh.
That's crazy because I don't really recommend that one a lot, but it's
you
come up again
that
with
to me.
you.
Actually bought it. Yes.
How did you find it?
I found it incredibly moving at a very slow pace.
Right.
I really enjoyed how slowly the professor...
mundane, right? Like nothing really happens in the book except a guy who's brought up in America on a dirt farm and he joins a university.
And it's called Columbia University, not the fancy one in New York, the one in Ohio, which I thought... and he just teaches literature. He's not even spectacular at it.
He's not very good at it.
Yeah.
And he just he
has
starts
one
an
affair.
Undergraduate.
Yeah.
He has one affair. He does his master's. He does his PhD.
Yeah.
And he kind of just bumbles along as like a mediocre professor.
Yeah.
And then one day he just dies in his bedroom.
Doesn't even compete for positions at university.
Right.
Yeah.
So for me, that was like, nothing has really happened. And yet I'm so moved and overwhelmed just by like the everyday existence that is life.
Yeah. It takes a place across years where you have like some books, which is just a day and it's full of action, right? Like this is the story of one night and like the world is completely changing. There's aliens. There's all kinds of stuff that is happening. In this book, it's the slowness of life that you really appreciate. You're like, fine, even with his relationships with his wife, how he just is ordinary.
Yeah.
Like just absolutely ordinary. But to write about something like that in such a moving way, he isn't, like when you read about fiction, when you read stories, you always have the protagonist always has a little shrapnel or a little shard that's special, that's kind of wedged inside them, that is heroic or otherworldly. His actions, if you really think about it, heroic actions, noble actions, no, just safe choices and like
unremarkable
risks.
Black and white. Nothing really. He didn't really inquire a lot about the world.
Yeah.
He didn't deeply question the world around him. The narrator questions the world around him, but he doesn't. And he just moves through it. I was like in tears after that book, and I wasn't even sure why. I feel like it's beautifully written, poetic, makes you realize that, wow, there's sometimes like just that knowledge that there's so much life happening around you exactly like this. It's just overwhelming.
Yeah.
And it's beautiful. And there's a part of you that fears it, that, oh no, I want to be something, right? Like, oh, I hope that doesn't happen to me. And yet a part of me feels like that is happening to you.
There's a safety.
And also, why does it even matter? Why not just be a witness? But no, it's beautiful. Like, I love that book.
There's a safety in his life being a constant 6.5 the entire time. Whereas I think anyone who has a creative bent glorifies the extremes. Have you played the video game, any of the GTA series at all?
You're lucky I can say yes to that, because I was never a gamer. But yeah, I've played a few.
Which
GTA
ones?
Games.
Have you played?
I can't remember, man.
Have you played Red Dead Redemption 2?
No.
If you like fiction, I genuinely believe it's the greatest video game story ever written. It's set in 1799 at the end of the outlaw era in America.
Okay.
There's a band of misfit outlaws who are trying to find a place where they can be truly free. None of them is really going to find that, but they all see that their way of life is under attack as America is becoming modern. It's their leader who is delusionally optimistic and knows how to rally people, a cult leader-esque figure by the name of Dutch van der Linde. But you're his second in command, and your name is Arthur Morgan, and you're the protagonist of the story.
Wow.
The story depends on your choices, and it has an honor system. So you can play bandit and kill civilians, or you can do the noble thing and let them go, or actually save them from other bandits.
Wow.
But it isn't merely stick figures running around. Everywhere from the detail of the horse you get, to your relationship with your horse, to the guns you use, to the rough masculine friendships you form with these other bandits. And in the end, there's a very powerful ending which totally depends on the choices you made. Completely depends on the choices you made. If you were a good man or a bad man. And if I'll just send you the YouTube cutscene of the end. It made me cry.
Wow.
A video game making you cry, because video games are, no matter how cinematic they are, I think people look at video games from the standpoint of, wow, look at how magnificent the screen looks.
Yeah.
Look at how awesome the details on his sword are.
See, I think ultimately we get carried away in form factors.
Yeah.
Right? But I think those, whether it's a video game or a novel or a Netflix series or some VR, world, all of those things share the same like psychological foundations, right? Like the desire for story, the desire for some kind of like meaning making, maybe a moment of pause, a moment of respite, escape, truth. And you can get that anywhere. Like it doesn't have to be in a paperback novel, right?
Yeah.
It can be through a game. Like I said, I've never that sounds amazing. I do send that clip. Never been much of a gamer, so I don't have a lot of knowledge of games, but I've played like a few games. Like there was the mobile game Monument Valley.
Mm-hmm.
Did you play that at all?
I haven't played that.
It's worth playing just because it's beautiful. You're like this little tiny, I don't even know what she's, a princess. And you just have to like solve these puzzles in this kingdom of geometric shapes. And you have to avoid like the crow people, which are just these like crow humans. And just the way it unfolds, it's really beautiful. It's very touching, right?
Wow.
Nothing really emotive explicitly happens, but it's like you're just touched by like the beauty and the majesty of it, and just navigating, roaming, you know. Feels like a walk in the woods. It's really.
There's also this game that I'm reminded of, which does not have a single dialogue.
Wow.
It takes place in I guess all weathers. It's called The Journey, which is a pretty generic name, but you're just this little black figure, and you have a little cape on, and you go through the Arctic tundra, absolute deserts. So think of it like life. Like life has some really hard tundras that you have to go through. There's a rainforest that you can sort of meander in and enjoy.
Yep.
As you're meandering in the rainforest, suddenly a big bad brute comes in your way. There isn't real attack. Sometimes you just get hurt by the brute and get knocked down a few pegs.
Yep.
But the game is called The Journey, so you have to keep going. So, and every now and then, far in the distance, you'll see someone else who's playing the game at the same time. But it isn't like they have a username on the top of their head or they come to interact with you. No, you just see them. They're actually players playing the same game at the same time across the world. So you also see that everyone else is on their journey. And you cross all these different landscapes and, you know, sometimes you have to cross over ruins and whatnot. But the journey keeps on going. And with each landscape that you pass through, your cape grows bigger. And in the end, I think you just ride off into the sunset.
What does it do for you knowing that there are other people here in the same space and context?
It's
as you just mentioned.
Yeah. Well, I would like to take a slightly different parallel. And have you watched Fantastic Mr. Fox?
I have read the book. Have I watched it? I don't think I have.
The one by Wes Anderson. It's a stop motion animation film.
I haven't watched it.
Well, so it's voiced by George Clooney, and Fantastic Mr. Fox is a clever, charming fox who always plays cons, but he's loved by his family. But he's very scared of wolves because the foxes in this world are civilian-like and human-like in their manners.
Lovely.
Whereas the wolf is not only unknown, it's primal. So there is a moment in the film where they're just driving on a scooter, because like these are human-like foxes, and they see a rock in the distance, and they see this black sinewy beast standing on it, looking at them. Fear runs down this fox's spine, but in a way, it looks like he's the human being looking at a more primal form of himself.
Wow.
In absolute appreciation. And then he tries this one thing where he just raises his fist up. Nothing happens. And then he sees the wolf also raise his fist up. And that's all their interaction is. And they go away forever. But he keeps that piece of the interaction with him. So what I feel about other people playing that game is sort of akin to what he feels in that moment. I don't understand it. Some people are probably more powerful figures in that game. They have sides that I admire, that maybe I have a little bit of in me. But I always think it's not necessary to interact with them. They can just exist.
Yeah.
Because I think too much mingling doesn't really solve anything.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know where I was trying to go with that.
No, I love it. And I really do, because I feel I also don't fully understand that emotion, but I know I'm like very, very curious about it, right? So for example, my reading behavior, if we're going to call it that, if I'm reading something I'm enjoying, and that's another point, I enjoy almost everything I read. Sometimes I feel the social pressure to like dislike some things just because, hey, how can you like everything, right? But
right.
I do. Couple of chapters in, or even a chapter in, I think I'll go down some internet rabbit hole about the author, the motivations, the inspirations. Halfway through the book, I think I'll be like, I've always been curious, like, especially with books that are perhaps less popular, is there anyone in the world at this very moment in time reading this? And through their eyes, what is this meaning? What is this meaning to them? And I do have this desire to like get to know that person or to talk about it after we've finished with reading. I've never really been part of book clubs formally. I think it's something I would like to. But I think there's a lot of, whether it's happening synchronously in a conversation or even asynchronously, right? Like Goodreads reviews, for example. It's all like asynchronous across the last however many years the site's been alive. And I don't know, man, I really enjoy seeing how people make meaning from these kind of stories. I feel like it's almost, I don't mean to like add, productize the novel any further. I don't think it's needed. But I am really interested in that behavior of strangers sharing like a meaningful context. In some ways, I feel like novels, again, I don't mean to bastardize the novel here, but like I do feel in some ways they're unrealized social networks, social communities. I feel like a book has the power to bring a lot of people together. And they do, of course. I feel like it can be, amplified even more. I do think that like there's some really interesting opportunities in the literary product space to really bring a lot of people together in contexts that they couldn't even imagine.
That's why your newsletter. But I have a slightly different approach on that. I never read prefaces. I never read introductions because I don't want the editor, translator's commentary or even the author's commentary on, hey, I've really updated this edition. This one contains this, that. I think it just adds baggage to the story.
Yeah, it biases you.
Yes.
Or it conditions you. I don't know if it's biased, but it definitely like the story would have been different if you've not read that.
Because you already go into a book with rose-tinted glasses. Some experiences, some recommendations already got you to buy the book or invest in the book in some way. And then I think the more second-hand lenses you put on it, the harder it is to really sort of see the story for what is. Which is why I used to do the Goodreads stuff, but now I don't. The only time I really value talking about a book is physically, but that's just me. Because I do not, and this might like, you might disagree with it. I do not like someone I do not know talking about a book, just out in the air, on the internet, because it doesn't do anything for me. I don't know who they are. And I also think there's just something in online communities, people are often trying to say the clever thing or the right thing.
Takes.
Like this book is a dialectic on the postmodern intersection of what happens when dogs become thieves. Like, what the fuck? You know what I mean? It's just there's so much.
It's alienating. It's just like,
it's the same with art. So when I was working at the 100%. Indie Art Fair, I really enjoyed just watching the art, just seeing the art. The epitaph is nice for context. But when you get someone else standing right next to you, what do you think it means? I don't want that conversation. I want this to be direct experience. I don't want it to be filtered through this. This is why I used to hate, when I was in university, I used to hate those classroom discussions. They're necessary for universities or whatnot, but I used to hate that we had to spend so much time through all this fluff to arrive at consensus. And then who decides the consensus? If I have a polarizing opinion about someone, I obviously have to tone it down because, the consensus is larger. So we arrive at something safe and pat and boring that I think does not do justice to just the primary source of the book itself. But that's just me.
I think you're changing my opinion on this now. Wow.
I didn't intend to.
No. I see. I hear you. I think that you're actually making me question myself a bit. Like I'm wondering, because I have a bit of an obsessive personality. Like most things in life, I'm really like 99% of things I'm pretty like zen or dispassionate about. Like they just don't really affect me. The 1 or 2% I really, really care about, right? So like and then I'm just obsessive, like, and I'll just follow that obsession till the end. So if I start enjoying an author, I'll devour everything that they've like written.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering now, hey, is that obsession because I'm going down that rabbit hole? Is it something I actually want to do? I know that I know that like it's do I know? Maybe I don't. But I do enjoy the experience of understanding like other folks' perspectives. I do find it very interesting what you said about like, let's say, literary criticism, right? I definitely think there's an art to it. I do think that I enjoy the works of certain critics. I think there's a beauty, even like meaning making from a novel.
Correct. Especially if it's a dense novel.
Yeah, it's that in itself, I think, is an art form, and it's not easy to do, right? And there's a real like there's actually a humility to it, I feel. But the funny thing is, I'm almost always a little bit skeptical when someone has immersed themselves in a piece of art or a piece of literature. They come out the other end and they immediately have words for that experience. Because I feel like everything that's happening inside of you is ultimately wordless, right? Like the rawness of direct first person experience. And I think we should just be with that for some time rather than rushing to find words to describe it, define it, analyze it, and project those words onto like a populace. I don't think that's needed. I think, and I feel like that's what you're saying as well, right?
Yeah,
like,
but I do exactly that, which is why I'm now.
Do you though? I don't think so.
No, I think it's with me and ideas. I immediately sell it to other people.
Right.
I will read a book and it's like, hey, I read this book about this guy. He's like, like he's an alcoholic. He's a famous writer. It's like I immediately synopsize the fuck out of it and start telling people. I think it comes from a good place.
Yeah.
What it does is it sort of fragments the experience, and I now realize it because I do it not with just books. If it's a good, I'm just a recommender. Like as a personality type,
So
I just
am I
recommend.
actually. I think so too.
Yeah. But I don't. Some experiences I just I don't treat them with the divinity that they must be treated as.
Right.
And so I have to tell myself in my inner monologue, you've let this one be. This is just yours. And that could be a book. That could be a letter that someone wrote to you. That could be like I have a private email correspondence with a few friends. That is just started with the intention of seeing where we can go.
Right.
It isn't regular, but it's very interesting what happens when you make a silent pact to keep it private.
Yep.
Because, coming back to content, you see broadcasts everywhere. You want to broadcast everything.
Yep.
And I think it's the things you don't broadcast, those really become like the solid anchors in your life. Like my family or the things I do off camera. The books I'm reading that I don't have to talk about now that I don't run a writing channel.
Yeah.
So there's all of those things that it's the things that you talk about, they're sort of you've already overtalked them. You've already thought them through in your head, which is why you're beating the idea to death till you can find like a new one.
The author of The Little Prince, he had this beautiful quote in the book, right? I think it was it the fox that said it in the book? Words are the source of misunderstandings in the world. And I feel like the world doesn't actually need more words in it. And yet we talk and talk and we write and write because it's also fun.
Yeah.
I think we just need ways to pass the time.
That's true.
No?
Yeah. Which is why I think reading is leisure.
Yeah.
And we can do a better job by reintroducing reading as leisure into our lives, because I think reading has become like one of those upskill things that India does. Hey man, you should read.
Everywhere, dude.
Yeah.
Not just India, everywhere. But what do you think about that, right? So to play devil's advocate now.
Yeah.
sometimes I feel like, I'm not saying that's what we're doing, but maybe a part of us is like sitting on your moral high horse and telling people like how should they should be spending their time and what they should be consuming and what they shouldn't be consuming, and saying that, hey, you know, attention is fragmented, people can't concentrate, people can't immerse themselves inside a 700-page novel. Maybe they shouldn't, right? Maybe if it resonates with you as an art form, then good. But why does it actually matter? Oh, is this perspective that perhaps we share, is it actually somewhat like of a Luddite perspective? Does it hold progress back, right? Because if everyone shared that perspective, let's say in a much more aggressive manner, there'd be no need for any more formats, right? There'd be no need for like podcasting, for example. And for me, like podcasting is a very special medium, right? I'm very new to it. You're amazing at it. But I find that, and you know why? It resonated with me. Like, it was a friend of mine that like got me into it, to listen to them. I didn't really understand, like many people, what they were, why they matter. Is because I felt like, you know, as a kid growing up, I used to imagine like the dining room of, let's say, I don't know, a prime minister, right, with his kids, or a famous writer, or like an intellectual or a thinker. And I'm like, those dinner conversations must have been crazy.
Yeah.
Right? Like, what would you give just to be a fly on the wall to listen in on a correspondence between, I don't know, Ernest Hemingway and F.
That was me and
right?
Lutyens Delhi, and all of that. I literally imagined that.
Yeah. Right? Like, and I feel that's what podcasting has democratized.
Yeah.
To some degree, right? Like, you can now be a fly on the wall in these extremely beautiful, unfiltered, hopefully unfiltered, free-flowing conversations. That's really powerful. I feel like for education and just like pleasure, that's a really amazing thing. So I sometimes feel if you hold, again, it's this classic tension between new and old. If you're just like too conservative about your mediums, then like, we're just not going to move forward, right? Culturally, we're just going to like be stuck. And that isn't the point either.
You've been doing so many of these episodes, right? I want to ask you something now. Do you think the real conversation happens before and after the podcast? The ones that you really wanted to like listen to when you were a kid?
Really good question. Yes and no. Cop-out answer. Total cop-out answer, but yes and no, right? No, because what I enjoy about podcasting and actually recording podcasts is that you have very intentional conversations.
That's true.
Right? Just the act of like committing to recording, publishing, a few people going to view it, ensures that like you will stick to topic, or at least live in a certain space, and not be distracted. We've not checked our phones much during this. We've not done random stuff, like got distracted, talked to someone, gone outside, gone for a walk. We are here in this moment together. So, and that's rare in the world, right? Unless if you're having a focused work meeting. Other than that, like, we don't really have that level of focus in our lives. Even like family dinners and stuff like that, they're pretty distracted affairs, right? So in that sense, no. But yes, in the sense, like, of course, like when you turn off the mic and the camera is off, people to some degree like loosen up, they relax, and then they'll share that offhanded comment that they couldn't share when recording. But I also feel like there's a lot of people today, I don't know, maybe I'm being naive, who seem like, you know, similar on camera and off camera. I think you are one of those people. Like when I spoke with you twice on your podcast, I don't recall the conversation we had after recording being largely different to the
one we had. That was on Zoom though.
That was on Zoom.
Yeah. So what I found after doing so many of these.
How many have you done, by the way?
I think 200-esque.
Wow.
Give or take over 3 years, and regularly now this year I think we're at episode 116, 117. Anyway, that's not the point. It's when you came in here, I was very happy to see my friend, and there was relief because I could speak to you even though we were distracted, like talking about shoes and other stuff on the terrace. there was a sense of rest.
Yeah.
I think when you're on camera, the time, the clock is sort of ticking, and there isn't so much of a background tension to say something clever or meaningful, but it has to be impactful. But I think when there are spaces between conversations, you just become more endearing to each other. With that, I still feel no matter how unfiltered you get, podcasts are slightly performative conversations.
Yeah, definitely.
But then the best part is, like, I really think that for me, the podcasts begin once the mic and the camera turn off after.
Interesting.
Because then the barriers of persona management and awkwardness and all of that have been transcended. And now we can really talk about our lives and sort of say, hi, how you doing? And confide. I find that after podcasts, people confide in me so much, and I do too. And I'm like, is this okay to be that vulnerable all the time? Because people are super vulnerable with me after the podcasts.
I get that.
And
I understand that.
And then I think
like that with you.
This is fiction, despite being unfiltered, raw conversations.
Yeah, definitely.
And what happens afterward is reality. But it's like, who would want to know? At the same time, you would not want to broadcast your life situation with the sort of ease you can do it with me one-on-one.
Yeah.
To the rest of the world. It's a tricky place, but
you're right. There's nothing. Can't really critique anything you said. I think it's like there's beauty in fact. There's a lot of beauty in fiction.
Yeah.
And I feel like I'm a lot more at peace with this than ever. I think I used to be one of these people like, oh man, social media is so performative.
Yeah.
And it is. But also like, it's okay. Like, perform well. Plays are great, right? I love to watch good films. Put on a good performance and then enjoy the times when you're not performing.
Yeah.
Like, I don't actually think one moment is truer or somehow more real than another. I think it's just respecting the medium. I think it's also about respecting the medium, right? Like, I think, I really do think that if you can express what you need to express or to paint this visual, visceral image in the mind of a reader through a haiku poem, and you don't need to write a novel about it, don't write the novel. Respect the medium, right? If you can compress and distill everything that needs to be distilled into 3 lines and like 7 words, do that.
Yeah.
Like, it's almost arrogant to say, no, I will continue on for 5,000 pages, right? Like, it's, just respect the medium. Podcasts, right? Respect the fact that, like, sure, it is about this conversation, but ultimately people will be listening to it as well, and it's being respectful of them. I don't know if we have been, because we've probably been talking a long time.
I don't know. But we are.
Yeah.
As a veteran of this industry,
right.
I will say we've been extremely mindful, but it's just that
this is another interesting point though, right? I feel like, and this is something I'm still figuring out, because I, like, with Lit Visions and stuff, it's still really new, really tiny. And I want to keep it like blissfully unoptimized for some time.
Please do.
And I'm just not like, I don't really need listeners or subscribers right now. I'm not going to play like sort of hacky games to get them. I think my promise will be like, hopefully an authentic, true conversation, probing some aspect of fiction, the future of literature, and other possibilities, right? With books, novels, and things like that. And yeah, it may be a little bit long form, but my personal philosophy on this, and this kind of links to a lot of the stuff that we were saying on attention, is that, like, yes, there is this attention deficit. People struggle to concentrate. Fine. Another way of looking at that is that actually, you know what? The things that will sort of capture attention now, maybe it's just like a higher bar, right? I still believe people have the capacity to be present and to concentrate, but you've just got to figure out, like, you got to do something that is it's worthy of someone's attention,
right?
Worthy of someone's like presence.
And podcasts are case in point for everyone who watches a short or a reel, which are, dopamine factories in essence. There's people who watch podcasts.
Yeah. So, and they're not optimized. I don't think so. Not yet. I mean, you'll know more than me, but it doesn't feel like, it still feels pretty raw. Like even looking at the tooling, like podcast analytics are comically,
very high.
Unless
you're a really bad host and you're sort of, if you're a founder or someone who deals with the public at least once a day, you're fine. If you can't form complete sentences, is when I would assume people don't want to listen to you.
Right.
If you can form complete sentences and every third sentence makes sense, you can have pretty high retention rates.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about the future. Do we have time?
Sure.
What do you think, given this conversation, the future of fiction looks like? What does that even mean to you?
I'm a little saddened.
Okay, sorry. Before you continue, let's just like bifurcate that, right? There's what do you think the future will look like? And then what do you think it should look like?
Okay. I know it's going to be some VR stuff for sure.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I don't think the page is going to be left alone to its devices. It's just we're going to have paperbacks and hard covers like we do with vinyls, even though they're making a comeback now. I think we're going to probably have something like the video game that I was mentioning, except that we can actually live those out.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not too excited about the future of fiction, TBH.
Okay.
Because I've recently started using a Kindle, which is optimized for notes for a future newsletter. So you can clearly see that the optimization has bled into my reading. What I think it should look like is I think the book should be left alone. And I think you can, metaverse the fuck out of everything else, but let the book be. But who am I?
I'm sort of with you, but I also think it will be left alone because there's nothing really that can be done with it. There's a question around like cultural relevance, right? But I also feel that like, again, this is kind of a parallel point, but I think there's always two industries and states of minds that you can back and invest in simultaneously, right? So if like the more the material world is progressing and capitalism and all the rest of it, technology, the more you should bet on like spiritual organizations
100%.
And mental health together, right? Because those things are going to create lots of beautiful new complex problems, and we will need to undo the damage from a lot of these things.
We need our primal circuits more than ever. There has never been a stronger case for that. I think we're already
That's why I'm still pretty confident about like the printed book, because it is antithetical, and we don't need to do anything to make it antithetical. It's just like it's like people are realizing now that wow, walks in nature are a good thing.
Yeah,
sunlight is a good thing.
There's
what a revelation.
Forest bathing.
Sunlight is a good thing. Like, what are we doing? Like
We've
these
lost
are
our way.
revelations now, right?
Yeah.
So I feel like again, I'm a big believer that whilst I believe in like innovation, technology, it's definitely good to keep building and thinking about the future. I feel like we have a lot of solutions that are cheap and ready for us, right? Books are a really cheap version of virtual reality, right? We should use them more. Books have therapeutic qualities and tendencies, and yet I don't think they are consciously used in clinical settings or environments.
That's very interesting. You think books can be used as clinical, like assists of some kind?
Why not? I really think, I'm not sure how, because I'm not like a mental health professional.
But people say reading is therapy. People say writing is therapy. They just say it in a colloquial way.
Exactly. It helps us. Sometimes I feel like we also complicate mental health. Like, yes, a lot more. Okay, we don't understand how the brain and the mind works. Fine. But we do know that there's certain things in our lives that feel really good. Again, sunlight feels good. Who would have thought? Walks in the wood feel good. You know, like drinking water is good for you. Exercise is good for you. So I feel in the same way that like we have a lot of this stuff. Do we need to spend billions and billions of dollars figuring out new stuff? Right? Like VR therapy. Okay, I'm sure it will be interesting. And I no doubt it will bring value in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
But we have how many like printed books in the world right now? And we're not really doing enough with them, right? Not enough people are necessarily reading them for pleasure. I think there's a lot. They have healing properties. I really believe that. And I'm not sure how it would work, but we're not even asking the question of how it would work.
Right.
So...
And we also think about upgrading everything all the time.
Exactly. The new is alluring, right? It's this like promise.
What do you want next? Like a book that has moving text. You know, it's just there's.
Yeah.
I think the visionaries who see themselves as quote unquote like Balaji Srinivasan living in the future.
Yep.
Fantastic people, and he's one of the most well-read people I have come across. But it's just that some things are already in their most elemental form. They do not require overcomplication.
Yeah.
We have the physical book, we have the Kindle. We have the summaries, we have the videos explaining the books, right? We do not want something else, because if we do, it's just, what are you doing?
Yeah.
What are you doing? Are you just... Because it's also new behaviors, right? I love Cal Newport, right? The guy's written Deep Work and other books. And he says that thumbs are not designed for, scrolling and texting. They're designed for like highly precise handicrafts and
dexterity.
Yeah, dexterity. Exactly. That's the word. So I think our eyes are designed for just, reading, and just, we don't need more. It's like saying, if you play a game and as you go through the levels, you have a sword, then it's a bigger sword, and then it's... I don't think we need to have a hedonistic treadmill for I'm disrupting the reading economy. There's no need.
Yeah.
There's really no need.
I agree and I disagree. Simultaneously, with equal intensity. Agree in the sense, you're right, we don't. Disagree in the sense, I do think like the extremes of that perspective means that we are no longer in the pursuit of wonder and trying out new things, because a lot of beautiful things can come out of those new things, right? But I'm largely with you, and I do get it, and especially with what you just said. I think like in one of the Lit Visions newsletters, I talked a little bit about like there's this Sunday edition called News to Novel. It's just fun. I just figuring out new ways to like discover books. I basically read. I've been reading The Economist for like many years. I really love like that. I don't read a lot of news, but I read The Economist. I enjoy that. And sometimes I like discover novels just because there's a topic in my mind, let's say Ukraine, and I want to experience almost like the interior lives of people in Ukraine. So then I go and figure out like what novel can I read to better understand this non-fictional event. So then every Sunday now, I basically go through news of the week, isolate, pick 4 events, and then go and research like 4 novels.
Not non-fiction?
No, non-fictional news.
News is non-fictional. I mean, like the novel is always fiction, right?
Yeah. It's always a work of fiction. I raised this because I've just forgotten why I raised this. It's getting late.
No, you were saying that you agree and disagree because there are we will forget wonder, and that's one way to add wonder to our lives is to.
Yes, I raised this because one of the news events was a New York Times article I read like a few weeks ago. It was talking about the launch of a new reading app, right? The launch of a new book discovery app in the US, right? Everyone's been trying to like disrupt libraries and Goodreads.
You've got Blinkist, book summaries.
Yeah, for nonfiction. And this is a new way of discovering books because you have 2 extreme approaches right now. Everyone sort of longs for the serendipity of, a fuzzy, warm, quiet, independent bookstore, right? And walking in and speaking to a human and they recommend this remarkable novel. Hey, Vinamre, you should read Stoner, the book you've never heard of, all of that. And then there's the hyper intense, like algorithmic approach of like, here are the books that are popular. You should read what's trending and popular. And everyone sort of in the technology world is trying to figure out like what's the middle ground, or how do you bring that offline magic into the digital sphere? And is there space for something else? Anyways, my personal feeling on this is that we don't even understand the problem of book discovery. Whether or not even to describe and articulate it as a problem, I'm unsure of. There's a few things I'm definitely sure of, right? The way that most people talk in that space is completely off. Like the book industry is really bad at telling its own story.
Yeah.
Which is ironic, right? Like a lot of people like, we're building the Netflix for books. And I'm like, oh wow, that's like the most anxiety-inducing thing I've heard. Like, why would you want to do that to the book, right?
Yeah.
Like you think that's aspirational. Netflix it's great for what it is, but like, I don't know if it's a relaxing place to be right now, right? And why would you want that for books?
Yeah. So we don't even have the books for books.
We don't even have the books for books. So like, I don't think we understand these problems, if even they are problems, and we're rushing for solutions. Because again, I think we need find interesting ways to make meaning and pass the time.
Well, I think one thing that is good, and I will say it as a good podcast host, is the newsletter. Which allows at least your personal interest to bleed out into a broadcasty format.
Yeah.
Which even if people glean one thing from it, it'll be, a book that they can start reading.
Yeah.
And then you've done your job. It doesn't need to be didactic. It doesn't need to be, hey, read this book because I am this person with this credibility, and so you must read it to be like me, which is where a lot of people approach book recommendation lists for.
Yeah.
In my previous life as a writing teacher and as someone who recommended books every month, it became very tiring because like how many books was I really reading from a place of inspiration? But it sort of became performative where I had to recommend books all the time. And then if you just keep following that train, it's like, now let's, 5 books that every 17-year-old should read. And it just becomes prioritized like that.
Yeah.
So you have to keep it enough. You have to keep it a mix of what people will glean stuff from, not blindly consume, but just glean stuff from, and where you are in your life.
I feel like this conversation has now fully come full circle. So it's probably a good time to end soon. But it literally comes back to what you said, I think, right at the start. Like your particular moment in time, right? Like how... because I do think there is this genuine conflict and tension. On the one hand, you can stay unoptimized and keep doing these like cute, fun, awesome things because you're doing them for you. Really, it's just like, it's something I do anyway. I've just like, maybe I can do it for others because I'm already doing it for myself. Yeah. That's literally the agenda for the newsletter and even the podcast. These are conversations and things I want to talk and write about anyway. Let me just record them. It'll be fun. But at some point, I think like once the pressure of having an audience or people who are like now invested in what you're saying and, being on the spotlight, it changes the flavor of your expression, which is all a good thing. Like you again, it's about respecting the platform, respecting the context. Like Vinamre can probably no longer say the same things when he had 20 viewers on his YouTube videos, right? Like, and that's not a bad thing. We always view that as like, oh, he's become less authentic.
Well, it's the same as constraints that you use in like a sport.
Yeah.
It's like just an audience is constrained that you must work around. That's where your creativity comes from. Yeah.
So like, I think a lot of these things, there's no real solution. It's just being aware of the tension.
Yeah.
That's it. Just being aware of it. That's enough. Like if you make your decision consciously from a space of like awareness, that's the right thing to do. Doesn't really matter what happens after that. I think that's
a cool little clever line that I'd like to say that, business coaches can probably use to sell like their consultancies to confused entrepreneurs. It's like, I would probably say, do you want to have impact or do you want it to have heart? But I really think it's that tension. It's like, do you want it to have impact where it's diluted, but it reaches the most amount of people, so you spread out, or do you want it to be this loaded thing that is you, but only a few people get it? And it's not.
That's also the beauty of being a novelist, as well, because those folks, like, sure, the flavor of work does change, especially after someone's had, like, let's say, a lot of writers, right, where they've had a bestseller, and there's something different about the forthcoming, like, work. Something different. Not sure what exactly, but it's like suddenly there is, and people talk about this all the time, that there's suddenly, like, there is that pressure of, like, okay, I'm probably going to sell 50,000 copies and I'll actually have readers this time. And maybe that affects the nature of the work. But a lot of the time it doesn't. And people just seem to be playing and having fun. It's a luxurious position to be in. I'm not sure it's the same case. It's the case for, like, people in other forms of art and other forms of expression. I feel like it's always good to retain that sense of, like, not actually the format, but the essence of who you are. Like, it's good to keep that and not to, because that's what made you special in the first place, right? I think people forget this. Like, that's what got you to this point to begin with.
Right.
It wasn't for optimization. It was just you just doing your own thing. And then people forget that, and it just gets like, it's like bands, right? Like, there's a lot of bands you don't really enjoy a lot of their later work post success, because it just feels like, something's flattened here.
Yeah.
Right. You started the extreme fringes, the bleeding edge of culture. And now, because, like, that doesn't actually sell 10 million albums, but it does sell a few thousand, to sell 10 million, you have to, like, move towards the center. Or maybe if you're really good and revolutionary, you expand culture itself and you take people along with you. I don't know.
But it's very tough.
Very tough.
And I think reinvention is something that not everyone can do. Some people just realize, I've had my swan song.
Yeah.
Now it's just time to just keep being in the middle. Yeah.
Okay. Last quick lightning question for you. You've already talked about a bunch of books here in the conversation, but would you like to name one book that has had a profound impact on your life? Ideally, something you haven't read recently.
Okay. Something I haven't read recently that has had...
Because I feel there's a lot of recency bias when it comes to...
Yes, that's
books.
true. That's true. I was going to say like a very recent book that I read. A book that has had a profound impact on my life would probably be Narcopolis.
Okay.
By Jeet Thayil, which takes place not far from here, in Kamathipura, which is the brothel district. Actually, it's a confusion between him and something by Khushwant Singh. Actually, anything by Khushwant Singh, because dirty or forbidden literature of any kind was condemned to me by my parents, or mentions of drug use or depraved human emotions or people doing non-protagonistic things, self-sabotage-esque things. So books by those authors, especially Narcopolis, actually, now that I think about it, because the first sentence, the first sentence in the book is 7 pages long. No periods till the end of the 7 pages, and it's the stories of people who go to opium dens and smoke really, really bad heroin. And I realized I didn't know I had a passion for
heroin.
Well, not that. But I did not know I had a passion for these forbidden kind of stories.
Right.
These stories that no one was willing to mention, that no one even cared about. Like, it isn't something that would make the national news. But it's stories that I felt very closely about, because they talked about parts of the psyche that are often forbidden to us in our Indian landscape, specifically in India, right?
A lot of repression.
Yes, a lot of repression where everything is... people tie a ribbon on everything and paint India. Well, this is what Jeet Thayil says. He says that, people paint India as like a country of perpetual children and mangoes and wine-colored days, but it's not the case at all. So that book really changed. It opened me up to a lot of things that I was blind to, and it made me more okay with, quote unquote, what people say, the Jungian shadow, or being okay with being friends with people who were considered morally dubious,
right?
Or
morally dubious,
or of criminal natures.
Yep.
And those have become some of my best friends, and they're not bad people. They're just wired differently.
Yeah.
So Narcopolis by Jeet, Thayil probably would be the book.
You should have him on your podcast.
I asked several times. He only goes to JLF.
Okay.
Yeah.
Dude, this was fun. Thank you.
Thank you for this. I haven't had a conversation as intense as this in a while.
Like
Relaxing in a very different way, because I haven't had a full-fledged conversation specifically about books and reading and about, I'm going to sound fake deep when I say about abstract stuff like life. Mostly because I glaze over those topics with most people, but it's this latent need that I have that I'm only able to fulfill sometimes in my private life that I was able to do today thanks to you. And I will give you a compliment. You stay with the tension. You stay with the tension. I don't do that. If it's too much tension, I crack a joke, which I think is wonderful.
I'm just not that funny, so I don't have that option. So I just have
you cracked the one joke that just instantly destroyed all my credibility with the heroin, which I think was wonderful.
I was like,
no. Of course, people should know that I've been well, if I say anything, people are actually going to believe me because it's been a pretty intense conversation. So I'm not going to say anything.
Do you feel like, okay, we really do have to end, but
yes.
Do you feel like as a host, you're not normally the protagonist of the conversation? You're rather like, I don't even know what you are. You're the narrator, you're the publisher, you're the narrator, you're the literary agent all in one. And now I feel like maybe you've been the protagonist in this one. Yeah.
I'm in my conversations, I'm more like a bus driver.
Humbler metaphors, I love it.
I'm just trying to make sure the bus doesn't crash and everyone gets. I don't know.
It's lovely. Taking a lot of people. Yeah.
It's because I haven't had enough time to sort of see what I do from a distance, which is why I'm looking forward to go on vacation. And even then, I don't think it really helps to start thinking too much about what you do. Yeah. Because it's good for elevator pitches and all that, but I'd rather let other people do that. The same as if you told yourself, hey, am I a fierce entrepreneur or am I like a tech entrepreneur? Like you kind of know it in your heart, but you don't want to define yourself too much, which is what we discussed. You want to put yourself in a box, but yeah.
Thank you, man. What a pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, there are a few simple ways you can show your love. First, do consider leaving a review and subscribing wherever you get your podcasts. This helps more listeners discover it and also just makes me very happy. Second, feel free to share this episode with one friend who loves fiction and you feel might enjoy the conversation. And finally, subscribe to the Lit Visions newsletter on Substack for podcast summaries, future essays, novel recommendations, and discussions about the future of literature. The web address is litvisions.substack.com. Until next time, have a beautiful week filled with fiction and possibilities.